My brother cornered my girlfriend at her apartment and said, "I can give you everything he can, plus actual passion." I found out because Jenna called me at work, hyperventilating so badly, I thought someone had died. It was 1 in the afternoon on a Thursday, and I was in the middle of reviewing architectural plans for a downtown renovation project when my phone lit up with her name. She never called during work hours, respected my focus time too much for casual check-ins. The moment I heard her voice, tight and shaking, I knew something had gone catastrophically wrong. She asked if I could come over immediately, said she needed to see me in person, couldn't explain over the phone. I told my supervisor I had a family emergency and drove the 20 minutes to her apartment building, going 15 over the speed limit the entire way. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel, and every possible disaster scenario ran through my mind. Cancer diagnosis, family member in an accident, something with her job that she'd been worried about lately. Jenna met me at her apartment door with red-rimmed eyes and a glass of water she kept gripping so tightly I thought it might shatter. She pulled me inside quickly, locked the door behind us with both the deadbolt and the chain, then stood there in her small entryway breathing like she'd just finished a marathon. I asked her what happened, and she couldn't get the words out at first, just kept shaking her head and wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. Finally, she told me my brother Nathan had been there an hour ago. My stomach dropped immediately because Nathan lived across town and had no reason to know where Jenna lived, let alone show up unannounced. She said he'd knocked on her door claiming he needed to talk to her about a surprise party they were supposedly planning for me. She'd let him in because that seemed plausible, because Nathan was my brother, and she'd trusted him. The moment she closed the door, his entire demeanor changed. Nathan had backed her toward the kitchen counter while she was getting him a glass of water, moving into her personal space in a way that made her instinctively step backward. Then he'd said the thing that made my blood turn to ice when she repeated it to me. He told Jenna he'd been watching us together for months, and he could tell I wasn't giving her what she really needed. He said he could give her everything I could offer, plus actual passion, actual intensity, the kind of connection she deserved. Jenna had frozen completely, unable to process what was happening fast enough to react. Nathan had put his hand on the counter beside her hip, effectively trapping her, and told her he'd been attracted to her since the moment we'd introduced them 6 months ago. He said he'd stayed quiet out of respect for me, but he couldn't keep pretending anymore, not when he could see how much better suited they were for each other. Jenna's voice broke when she described how he'd leaned closer, how she'd been genuinely afraid he was about to kiss her, or worse. She'd managed to duck under his arm and get distance between them, told him firmly to leave her apartment immediately. Nathan had laughed like she was being dramatic, said she was overreacting to a simple expression of feelings, that she should be flattered he'd been brave enough to be honest. Jenna had grabbed her phone and threatened to call the police if he didn't leave right then. That had finally gotten through to him. He'd raised his hands in mock surrender, said something about her being uptight just like me, and left. But before he walked out, he'd turned back and told her to think about what he'd said, that the offer would remain open when she inevitably realized I was boring her. Jenna had locked the door the second he left, then stood there shaking for 10 minutes before she could calm down enough to call me. She showed me text messages Nathan had sent her afterward, casual messages asking if she was okay, saying he hoped he hadn't scared her, that he just wanted her to know she had options. The audacity of it made me want to put my fist through her wall. I called Nathan immediately from Jenna's apartment. He answered on the third ring sounding completely normal, asking what was up like nothing had happened. I asked him what the fuck he thought he was doing going to Jenna's apartment. There was a pause, then he laughed this easy, comfortable laugh that made me want to reach through the phone. He said Jenna was being dramatic, that he'd just stopped by to talk and she'd taken it the wrong way. I told him Jenna said he'd cornered her and propositioned her. Nathan's tone shifted immediately, became defensive and sharp. He said that wasn't what happened at all, that he'd simply been honest about having feelings, and Jenna had freaked out because she couldn't handle someone being straightforward with her. I was pacing Jenna's small living room while we talked, my free hand clenched into a fist so tight my nails were digging crescents into my palm. Nathan said something that made me see red. He said maybe if I was meeting Jenna's needs properly, she wouldn't have been so receptive to his attention earlier. I told Nathan that Jenna wasn't receptive, she was trapped and scared, and if he ever went near her again, I'd make sure he regretted it. He told me I was being dramatic just like her, that I needed to calm down and recognize that attraction isn't something you can control. He said he'd done the honorable thing by being upfront instead of pursuing her behind my back. The twisted logic of that statement left me speechless for a moment. He'd somehow convinced himself that cornering my girlfriend in her own apartment to proposition her was more honorable than keeping his mouth shut. I told him we were done, that he was no longer welcome in my life, and hung up before he could respond. Jenna was sitting on her couch with her knees pulled up to her chest, watching me with wide eyes. She asked if I believed her version of events. The fact that she even had to ask broke something in me. I sat down next to her and pulled her against my chest, feeling how badly she was still shaking. I called my parents that evening from my own apartment after making sure Jenna's locks were secure and she felt safe enough for me to leave. My mom answered and immediately launched into asking about my week, when I was coming for Sunday dinner. Had I talked to Nathan recently because he'd seemed stressed? I cut her off and told her what Nathan had done. The silence on her end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she asked if I was sure I wasn't misunderstanding the situation, said Nathan wouldn't do something like that, suggested maybe there was confusion about his intentions. The instinct to defend him, even before hearing his side, made my jaw clench. I told her Jenna had no reason to lie, that Nathan had essentially admitted it to me on the phone, that he'd sent follow-up texts to Jenna afterward. My mom's voice got smaller, uncertain. She said she'd talk to Nathan and get to the bottom of this. I told her there was no bottom to get to. The situation was clear, and if she wanted to maintain a relationship with me, she needed to take this seriously. My dad got on the phone, and his response was different, angrier. He asked if Nathan had touched Jenna inappropriately or just talked. I said just talked, but in a way that was predatory and threatening. My dad sighed heavily and said, "Boys sometimes compete for women," that it was natural even if the timing was poor. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Natural. He was calling my brother propositioning my girlfriend natural. I asked him if he'd feel the same way if someone had cornered my mom in her home and told her she deserved better than him. That shut him up. He cleared his throat and said he'd have a serious conversation with Nathan, make sure he understood boundaries. I told both my parents that Nathan wasn't welcome at any family gatherings I attended going forward, that this wasn't something that could be smoothed over with a conversation and an apology. My mom started crying, saying I couldn't split the family like this over a misunderstanding. I told her Nathan had split the family when he decided my relationship was something he could target. Nathan sent me a long email that night with the subject line, "Can we talk like adults?" I deleted it without reading past the first paragraph, which started with him explaining that he'd always had trouble expressing emotions appropriately, and maybe his approach had been too direct. No, maybe about it. He'd been predatory and calculated. I blocked his email address, his phone number, all his social media accounts. Jenna did the same, but blocking someone doesn't erase what they did or the fear they instilled. Jenna started jumping at unexpected knocks on her door, started checking her locks multiple times. Before bed, started asking me to stay over most nights because being alone in her apartment made her anxious. She'd lived there for 3 years without any issues, and now Nathan had contaminated that safety in a single afternoon. I found myself driving past her building at odd hours when I couldn't sleep, just to make sure Nathan's car wasn't parked nearby. The paranoia was exhausting but necessary. 2 weeks after the incident, Jenna's building manager called her about a package delivery. Someone had dropped off a gift basket addressed to her with no return address or card. The manager described it as elaborate, expensive-looking, filled with wine and chocolates and fancy crackers. Jenna told him to throw it away, that she hadn't ordered anything and didn't want unknown packages brought to her apartment. The manager seemed confused but agreed. Jenna called me immediately, convinced Nathan had sent it. I drove over and we went down to the building's mailroom together. The manager had set the basket aside rather than disposing of it, and when we examined it closely, we found a small card tucked between the wine bottles. It said simply, "Thinking of you," in handwriting neither of us recognized, but that had to be Nathan's. The violation of it made Jenna physically nauseous. He knew where she lived, obviously, but this confirmed he was still thinking about her, still trying to insert himself into her life. I took the basket to the police station the next morning and filed a report. The officer who took my statement was professional, but not particularly optimistic about what they could do. He explained that one gift basket with a vague card didn't constitute harassment or stalking under the legal definition, especially since there was no proof Nathan had sent it. He suggested documenting everything in case a pattern emerged, keeping all texts and emails and messages, noting any times Nathan showed up places he shouldn't be. The officer gave me paperwork about restraining orders and what evidence would be needed to obtain one. I left the station feeling frustrated and helpless. The system required Nathan to escalate before we could stop him, required Jenna to be endangered further before protective measures kicked in. We were supposed to just wait and see if my brother's obsession with my girlfriend would intensify enough to meet legal thresholds. Nathan showed up at my parents' house the following Sunday during the family dinner. I'd explicitly said I wouldn't attend if he was there. My mom called me afterward crying, saying Nathan had spent the entire meal talking about how I'd abandoned the family over a simple miscommunication, how I'd always been overdramatic and quick to cut people out of my life. He'd apparently painted himself as the victim, the misunderstood younger brother whose honest expression of feelings had been twisted into something sinister. My mom said other family members were starting to ask questions, wondering if maybe I was overreacting. My uncle had apparently suggested that competition between brothers over women was normal, that we'd work it out eventually. The casual dismissal of what Nathan had done, the willingness to reframe predatory behavior as normal sibling rivalry, made me furious. I told my mom I wasn't interested in attending family events where Nathan was present and welcomed, that she'd have to decide which relationship she valued more. Jenna's coworker mentioned seeing someone matching Nathan's description in the coffee shop across from her office building 3 days in a row. The coworker, Diana, knew about the situation because Jenna had confided in her, and Diana had been helping her stay aware of her surroundings. Diana said the man had been sitting by the window with a laptop, positioned where he had a clear view of Jenna's office building entrance. She'd taken a discreet photo on the 3rd day and texted it to Jenna. The photo was grainy and taken from an angle, but it was clearly Nathan. He was watching Jenna's workplace, learning her schedule, tracking her movements. We added Diana's testimony, and the photo to our growing documentation file. I called the police again and was told the same thing as before. Concerning but not illegal to sit in a public coffee shop, not enough for a restraining order yet. Keep documenting. The legal system's hands-off approach until actual violence occurred felt like being asked to wait for a bomb to explode before calling it dangerous. I confronted Nathan at his apartment the next evening. I'd driven there directly after work, parked outside his building, and called him from the parking lot demanding he come down to talk. He'd refused at first, said we had nothing to discuss until I was ready to be reasonable. I told him I had photos of him stalking Jenna's workplace, and I was 2 seconds away from making those photos very public among our family and friend groups. That got him moving. He came down to the parking lot wearing gym shorts and a t-shirt, arms crossed defensively before he even reached my car. I got out and stood facing him in the fading evening light with other residents coming and going around us. I told him he needed to stay away from Jenna completely. No more showing up at her apartment or workplace. No more gifts. No more anything. Nathan's expression was hard to read, cycling between defensive anger and something that looked almost like hurt. He told me I was being controlling and possessive, that Jenna was her own person who could decide for herself who she wanted in her life. I pointed out that she'd already decided by blocking him and filing police reports. Nathan laughed bitterly and said those police reports wouldn't go anywhere because he hadn't actually done anything wrong. He said all he'd done was express feelings and give a gift, both of which were completely legal activities. The smug certainty in his voice made my hands shake. I told him that if he came near Jenna again, legal or not, he'd regret it. Nathan stepped closer to me, invading my space the same way he'd invaded Jenna's, and asked what exactly I planned to do about it. We stood there in his apartment parking lot in a staring contest that felt like it could turn physical at any moment. Finally, Nathan stepped back and said Jenna would come to him eventually when she got tired of my boring, predictable life. Then he turned and walked back into his building without another word. I hired a lawyer the next day. Her name was Catherine Vega, and she specialized in harassment and stalking cases. Catherine listened to everything, reviewed all our documentation, looked at the photos and texts and police reports. She said we had a case for a restraining order, but it was borderline, that judges could go either way on these situations depending on their interpretation of threat level. She recommended we add more documentation if possible, suggested Jenna vary her routines to make it harder for Nathan to track her patterns, advised installing security cameras at Jenna's apartment entrance. Catherine also suggested something I hadn't considered, documenting Nathan's social media activity. She said stalkers often revealed their mindset online, posting about their targets indirectly or expressing frustration about being rejected. We started monitoring Nathan's Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter accounts. What we found was disturbing in its subtlety. Nathan had been posting vague status updates about how society tells men to suppress their feelings, then punishes them for being honest. He'd shared articles about emotional authenticity and posted quotes about how the best things in life require taking risks. None of it explicitly mentioned Jenna, but the timing aligned perfectly with his escalating behavior. He'd posted a photo of a sunset with a caption about patience being rewarded, posted the day after sending the gift basket. He'd shared a meme about how the friend zone is a myth created by people afraid of real connection, posted 2 days after I'd confronted him in his parking lot. Catherine printed everything and added it to our file. She said the pattern of posts showed Nathan's ongoing obsession and sense of entitlement, which would strengthen our case. We scheduled a court date to request the restraining order for 3 weeks out. Jenna's apartment building installed security cameras at the main entrance after I'd offered to cover the cost. The building manager had been resistant initially, citing budget constraints and installation complexity, but became much more cooperative when I showed him the police reports about Nathan. The cameras went live on a Monday morning, and by Wednesday evening they'd already captured Nathan entering the building. He'd waited until someone was leaving, caught the door before it closed, and slipped inside. The timestamp showed him in the lobby at 6:15 in the evening, the same time Jenna usually got home from work. Building. Security footage from the hallway cameras showed him standing outside Jenna's apartment door for almost 20 minutes, just standing there like he was working up courage to knock or listening for sounds inside. Jenna hadn't been home, had stayed late at work that evening by coincidence. If she'd been there, if she'd opened her door without checking the peephole first, she would have come face to face with Nathan lurking in her hallway. The security footage was exactly what Catherine needed. She filed an emergency restraining order request, and we had a hearing within 48 hours. Nathan showed up with his own lawyer, someone he'd apparently hired as soon as he received the court summons. His lawyer tried to argue that Nathan had legitimate family business at the building, that his brother's girlfriend lived there and he'd been trying to deliver a message. Catherine destroyed that argument by pointing out Nathan had entered the building through subterfuge, had my phone number and multiple other ways to contact me, and had stood outside Jenna's specific apartment door for 20 minutes without knocking. The judge reviewed the security footage, looked at our documentation file that had grown to over 60 pages, and granted a temporary restraining order on the spot. Nathan had to stay at least 500 feet away from Jenna at all times, couldn't contact her through any means, and couldn't go to her apartment building or workplace. The order would remain in effect for 6 months pending a full hearing. Nathan's face when the judge announced the restraining order was a mixture of shock and rage. He'd clearly expected his lawyer to get the request dismissed, thought his careful avoidance of explicitly threatening behavior would protect him. Instead, the judge had looked at the pattern of conduct, seen it for what it was, and shut it down. As we left the courtroom, Nathan tried to approach me in the hallway. His lawyer grabbed his arm and pulled him back, reminding him that violating a restraining order was a criminal offense. Nathan shook off his lawyer's hand and called after me that this wasn't over, that legal orders didn't change how people felt, that Jenna would see through my manipulation eventually. Catherine walked between us and told Nathan clearly that any further contact with me or anyone connected to Jenna would be reported to the court. Nathan's lawyer looked mortified and physically turned Nathan toward the exit, pushing him away before he could dig himself deeper. The restraining order changed everything and nothing. Jenna felt safer knowing Nathan legally couldn't approach her, but she also knew a piece of paper wouldn't physically stop him if he decided to ignore it. We upgraded her apartment security with a video doorbell and reinforced locks. She started parking in different spots at work and varying her lunch schedule. I walked her to her car most evenings, hyper-aware of every person in the parking garage, every shadow that moved unexpectedly. The constant vigilance was exhausting but necessary. Catherine warned us that the period right after a restraining order was often when stalkers escalated, feeling like they were losing control and needed to reassert it. She told us to be especially careful for the next few weeks, while Nathan adjusted to the new reality. My parents finally understood the severity of the situation after the restraining order was granted. My mom called me crying, apologizing for not taking it seriously enough initially, saying she'd had no idea Nathan's behavior had escalated to stalking. My dad was quieter, ashamed. He admitted he'd been thinking about it like normal sibling competition because that's how he'd chosen to frame it in his mind. But the court documentation had made him confront what Nathan had actually been doing. They'd gone to Nathan's apartment to talk to him after the hearing. Nathan had apparently raged at them, blamed me for turning the family against him, insisted Jenna had been sending him signals and I'd just been too oblivious to notice. My dad said Nathan's disconnect from reality had scared him, the way Nathan had genuinely convinced himself he was the victim in this situation. They offered to pay for therapy for Nathan, tried to get him to see that his behavior was obsessive and inappropriate. Nathan had thrown them out of his apartment. 3 weeks passed without incident. Jenna started to relax slightly, stopped checking over her shoulder quite as frequently. We went to dinner at nice restaurants and to movies and tried to reclaim some normalcy. Then Jenna's co-worker Diana called her one evening while we were watching a show at my apartment. Diana sounded worried, said she'd seen Nathan's car parked on the street outside Jenna's office building that afternoon. Not in the coffee shop, not 500 feet away, but right there on the street with Nathan sitting in the driver's seat staring at the building entrance. Diana had taken photos with timestamps and license plate visible. That was a clear violation of the restraining order. Catherine filed the violation report immediately, and police were dispatched to Nathan's address. He wasn't home. His landlord said he'd left that morning with a packed duffel bag and hadn't been back. The next 48 hours were terrifying. Nathan had gone dark, wasn't at his apartment or his workplace or my parents' house. His phone went straight to voicemail. His social media accounts went silent. Catherine said this was the most dangerous phase, when someone subject to a restraining order disappeared rather than complying. Police couldn't actively search for him since he wasn't a fugitive, just someone who'd violated a civil protection order. We were told to stay alert, keep documenting, call 911 immediately if Nathan appeared. Jenna stayed at my apartment the entire time, afraid to go home, even though security cameras would alert us if Nathan approached her building. I took time off work to stay with her. We barely slept, jumping at every sound in the hallway outside my apartment, checking the security camera feeds obsessively. My parents called multiple times asking if we'd heard from Nathan, growing increasingly worried that he was spiraling. Nathan showed up at Jenna's workplace 72 hours after disappearing. It was a Friday afternoon, and Jenna had insisted on going back to work, said she couldn't let Nathan's behavior control her entire life. I'd driven her there, and was supposed to pick her up at 5. At 3:30, Diana called me in a panic saying Nathan had walked into their office lobby and was demanding to see Jenna. Building security was there, but Nathan was yelling, causing a scene, saying he had every right to see her and talk to her. I was across town at a project site meeting and told Diana to call the police immediately, that I'd get there as fast as I could. I ran to my car and drove through downtown traffic with my hazards on, calling Jenna repeatedly. She wasn't answering. Diana texted me updates. Police were there. Nathan was being arrested. Jenna was safe, but shaken. The entire drive I kept imagining worst-case scenarios, kept seeing Nathan forcing his way past security and reaching Jenna before help arrived. When I got to Jenna's office building, police cars were parked outside with lights flashing. Nathan was in the back of one of the cruisers, head tilted back against the seat, eyes closed. He looked defeated and exhausted. Officers were interviewing witnesses in the lobby while building security reviewed footage. I found Jenna in her office with Diana and their manager, all three of them watching through the window as police processed the scene below. Jenna saw me and burst into tears, and I held her while she shook. She said Nathan had looked wild when he'd walked into the lobby, kept saying he needed to explain something to her, that if she'd just listen, she'd understand. Security had intercepted him before he reached the elevator, physically blocking his path. Nathan had tried to push past them, and that's when they'd called police. He'd been shouting Jenna's name, saying she was making a mistake trusting me, that I'd been poisoning everyone against him. Jenna had watched from her fourth-floor window as Nathan was handcuffed and placed in the police car. The violation of the restraining order meant Nathan spent the weekend in jail. His arraignment was Monday morning, and Catherine made sure we were there, made sure the judge saw us, and understood the human cost of Nathan's obsession. The prosecutor argued that Nathan had shown clear disregard for court orders and posed a continuing threat. Nathan's lawyer tried to claim Nathan had been having a mental health crisis and needed treatment, not punishment. The judge looked tired and frustrated. She extended the restraining order to 1 year, added electronic monitoring requirements for Nathan, and sentenced him to 30 days in jail, plus mandatory psychological evaluation and treatment. Nathan would be required to check in with a probation officer weekly and couldn't go within half a mile of either Jenna's apartment or her workplace. If he violated any conditions, he'd face criminal stalking charges with potential prison time. Nathan looked hollowed out standing there as the judge listed the conditions, like he'd finally realized the consequences of his actions. My parents attended the arraignment and my mom cried through the entire proceeding. Afterward, she hugged me tightly and apologized again for not seeing how serious Nathan's behavior had been. She said they were going to help Nathan get treatment, but they understood if I needed distance from the entire family for a while. My dad looked older than I'd ever seen him, worn down by having to watch his younger son be sentenced while his older son stood on the opposite side of the courtroom. He said he was proud of me for protecting Jenna, ashamed he hadn't raised Nathan better, wasn't sure where they'd gone wrong. I told him Nathan's choices were his own, that mental health issues might explain behavior, but didn't excuse it. We stood in the courthouse hallway having a conversation years overdue, finally acknowledging the dysfunction we'd all ignored for too long. Jenna and I went to couples counseling after the arraignment. We needed help processing the trauma of the past few months, needed tools to rebuild the sense of safety that Nathan had destroyed. Our therapist, Dr. Linda Brennan, specialized in trauma recovery and relationship repair. She helped us work through Jenna's lingering anxiety, her tendency to catastrophize every unknown sound or unexpected knock. She helped me process my guilt about Nathan's behavior, my misplaced sense of responsibility for something my brother had chosen to do. We learned communication strategies for handling stress, ways to support each other without enabling fear or avoidance. Dr. Brennan reminded us that we'd survived something designed to break us apart, and we'd chosen each other consistently throughout. That resilience would serve us well going forward. Nathan served his 30 days and entered a 60-day residential treatment program afterward. The psychological evaluation had diagnosed him with obsessive love disorder and narcissistic personality features. His therapists said he'd constructed an entire fantasy relationship with Jenna in his mind, convinced himself they had a deep connection based on minimal interaction. He'd interpreted her basic politeness as romantic interest, seen my relationship with her as an obstacle to overcome rather than something to respect. The treatment program worked on helping Nathan understand boundaries, recognize obsessive thought patterns, develop healthier relationship expectations. My parents visited him weekly and reported that he seemed genuinely remorseful, though they acknowledged that could be manipulation. Trust, once destroyed, was almost impossible to rebuild. I had no interest in visiting Nathan or communicating with him. That bridge had burned, and I felt no obligation to reconstruct it. 6 months after Nathan's arrest, Jenna and I moved in together. We found a new apartment across town, somewhere Nathan had never been and couldn't associate with her. The fresh start felt necessary, like we were reclaiming our relationship from his shadow. We painted the walls colors Jenna loved, hung art we'd collected together, built a space that was entirely ours. Jenna's anxiety had improved significantly with therapy, though she still checked locks twice and maintained awareness of her surroundings in ways she never had before. The trauma had changed her, made her more cautious but also stronger. She'd survived being stalked by someone she'd trusted as family, and had come through it determined not to let fear control her life. I'd never admired anyone more. Nathan completed his treatment program and the terms of his probation. He moved to a different city, got a new job, started what his therapists called a fresh start. My parents maintained contact with him, but respected my decision to keep distance. They'd come to our new apartment for dinners and holidays, carefully avoiding mention of Nathan unless I asked. My mom would occasionally update me that he was doing well, staying in therapy, not dating anyone yet. I didn't need or want those updates, but understood she needed to share them, needed to believe her younger son could recover and become someone different. Maybe he could. People changed, sometimes, but that didn't obligate me to witness it or welcome him back into my life. Some betrayals severed relationships permanently, and that was okay. Jenna and I got engaged a year after Nathan's arrest. I proposed at the beach where we'd had our third date, full circle to a time before Nathan had contaminated our happiness. She said yes immediately, laughing and crying simultaneously. We planned a small wedding with only our closest friends and family. My parents would be there. Nathan would not be invited. My mom had asked tentatively if we'd consider it, said Nathan was doing so much better, but I'd shut that down immediately. Our wedding would be a celebration of what we'd built together and survived together, and Nathan's presence would taint that. My mom had accepted it sadly, but understood. Some consequences were permanent. The wedding was beautiful, intimate, everything we'd wanted. We wrote our own vows, and I included lines about choosing each other even when tested, about building something strong enough to withstand attempts to destroy it. Jenna's vows talked about finding safety in someone who fought for her, who believed her, who stood beside her when it would have been easier to dismiss or minimize. We weren't naive enough to think marriage meant never facing challenges, but we'd already faced a significant one and emerged stronger. That foundation felt solid in ways many couples never experienced until years into marriage. We'd been tested early and violently and had chosen each other consistently. That mattered more than the perfect story most couples got to tell. Nathan sent a card to our wedding, despite not being invited. My parents gave it to me after the reception, looking uncomfortable. The card said simply, "Congratulations. I'm sorry. I hope you're both happy." I read it once and threw it away. Words were easy. Behavior was what mattered. Nathan had shown me who he was through months of harassment and stalking, and a card didn't change that history. Jenna didn't even want to know what it said, just asked if I'd thrown it out. I had. We spent our honeymoon in Scotland, hiking through the Highlands and staying in small bed and breakfasts, run by people who'd never heard of Nathan and knew nothing about our story. The distance felt necessary, like we were finally outrunning the shadow he'd cast over the first years of our relationship. 2 years after our wedding, Jenna gave birth to our daughter, Sophie. The pregnancy had been mostly smooth, and labor lasted 8 hours before Sophie arrived, tiny and perfect, and ours. Holding my daughter in the hospital while Jenna slept, exhausted from delivery, I felt this overwhelming gratitude that we'd survived Nathan's attempts to destroy what we were building. Sophie existed because Jenna and I had chosen each other, had fought for our relationship, had refused to let obsession and harassment win. My parents came to meet their granddaughter, and my mom cried happy tears, telling Sophie she was the most beautiful baby she'd ever seen. My dad held his granddaughter with reverent care, said she had my eyes and Jenna's smile. Neither of them mentioned that Sophie also had an uncle she'd likely never meet. That absence was its own kind of presence, but one we'd all learned to live with. Nathan called my parents from his new city when he found out about Sophie's birth. He asked if he could send a gift, maybe a card. My parents, to their credit, asked me first. I said no without hesitation. Nathan wasn't part of this, wasn't part of our family, wasn't someone I wanted anywhere near my daughter, even in the abstract gesture of a gift. My mom sounded sad when I said it, but didn't argue. She told Nathan no, told him this was my decision to make, and she supported it. Nathan apparently accepted it quietly, said he understood, hoped maybe someday things would be different. Maybe they would. But that day wouldn't be today or tomorrow or anywhere in the foreseeable future. Some bridges, once burned, left foundations too damaged to rebuild on. 5 years passed. Sophie grew into a curious, energetic child who loved dinosaurs and drawing and asking endless questions about everything. Jenna had been promoted to creative director at her company and found fulfillment in work that challenged her. I'd started my own architectural firm with 2 partners and was designing residential projects around the city. We'd bought a house in a quiet neighborhood with good schools and friendly neighbors who knew nothing about Nathan. Life was full and good and ordinary in the best possible way. We rarely talked about Nathan anymore, rarely thought about those months of fear and hypervigilance. The trauma had faded into background noise, something we'd survived but didn't define us. We'd built something beautiful despite his attempts to destroy it, and that felt like the truest victory. Nathan had stayed in his new city, built his own life, maintained distance. My parents updated me occasionally, always asking permission first. He was engaged to someone he'd met in therapy support group, someone who knew his history. He'd changed careers to something less stressful. He still saw his therapist weekly. He'd never asked again to meet Sophie or attend family gatherings I'd be at. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.